Ladies and gentlemen, permit me, please, to claim your attention for a moment.
In the words of Winston Churchill, in the Second World War, every bond between man and man was to perish. Crimes were committed by the Germans under the Hitlerite domination to which they allowed themselves to be subjected, which find no equal in scale and wickedness with any that have darkened the human record. The wholesale massacre by systematized processes of 6 or 7 millions of men, women and children in the German execution camps exceeds in horror the rough and ready butcheries of Genghis Khan, and in scale reduces them to pygmy proportions. Deliberate extermination of whole populations was contemplated and pursued by both Germany and Russia in the Eastern War. The hideous process of bombarding open cities from the air, once started by the Germans, was repaid 20-fold by the ever-mounting power of the Allies, and found its culmination in the use of the atomic bombs, which obliterated Hiroshima. And again, an international institution was to be established, in the hope of bringing about a new world of collective security, later seen in the form of the League of Nations. In early 1919, the Germans were summoned to Versailles, not to negotiate, but rather to hear the terms they would have to implement and endure. David Lloyd George of Great Britain, Woodrow Wilson of America, George Clemenceau of France, and Orlando of Italy all attended with the aim of weakening Germany. World War I had radically altered the political European map, with the defeat of the Central Powers including Austria-Hungary, Germany, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire. The German state that came out of the Great War was also to experience profound change and suffer severe territorial losses. Germany was to lose a portion of its eastern land, creating a new Polish state and establishing a Polish corridor between Germany and East Prussia, giving Poland access to the sea. The port city of Danzig, the largest city on the coast, was given to the League of Nations. Mabel in the Baltic was handed over to Lithuania, Alsace-Lorraine to France, and the mineral-rich Saarland was to be administered by the League of Nations for a span of 15 years, with the Rhineland becoming a demilitarized zone, providing France with additional security. The German colonies in Africa were distributed to the British and the French after the struggle of the First World War, and the victors sufficiently armed in vigilance. But errors were soon made. America's failure to enter the League of Nations, the weakness and lack of resolution of Western democracies to confront the growing strength of the fascist dictators in Germany, Italy and Japan, and the economic turmoil that allowed these events to spark and build. Upon reflection, it is all too easy to see and understand how this tragedy could have been avoided, but for those in power at the time, they failed all too well to see the gathering storm that confronted them. The origins of the Second World War can be found within the confines of the Palace of Versailles. Germany's surrender in the First World War was a shock to both the international community as well as to its people. Militarily, Germany had been successful on the Eastern Front. Troops were deep within France and Germany itself was untouched. However, on November 11, 1918, at 11 a.m, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, a ceasefire came into effect. An armistice had been signed and the war to end all wars had come to an end. The proud peoples of Germany had been defeated. The Allies, victorious after 4 years they had made to Germany, and the economy collapsed overnight. Due to such large reductions in cash and capital, banks struggled to provide money and credit, and so in 1931 there were runs on German and Austrian banks, with several of them closing. Businesses closed at an alarming rate, and by 1933 unemployment had reached 6 million. Many people were left homeless and thousands of children died from malnutrition. A lack of government resolve and out of despair, many turned to alternative political leaders and parties in the hope their problems would be solved. One man in particular garnered a lot of attention from his rousing speeches, and this man was Adolf Hitler. Hitler's speeches delivered clear culprits for Germany's problems. The November criminals who had signed the armistice ending World War I, the liberals and socialists who had signed the Treaty of Versailles, the communists who threatened revolution in Germany, and finally the Jewish bankers who plotted to undermine and destroy the German state. The Nazi and Communist parties both clashed violently, and Hitler claimed to be the only one to bring about order and end the Red Plague. As a powerful and gifted public speaker, Hitler was able to capitalize on public discontent. His party, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or the Nazi Party, grew to record levels. In September of 1930, the Nazi Party had increased its representation in the Reichstag, the German parliament almost tenfold, winning 107 seats, and only 2 years later in 1932, distributed to the British and the French, and their South Pacific colonies would be given to Japan. In addition, military clauses were added to the treaty. The German army could be no larger than 100,000 troops, they were allowed no air force, no tanks or heavy artillery, and the German navy could have no more than 6 warships, with no U-boats or submarines. Insult being added to injury, a war guilt clause was placed in the treaty, making Germany accept full responsibility for the outbreak of the war, as it was only on this basis that the Allies could demand reparations. France and Britain had begun the war as creditor states, but had ended as debtor nations and wanted to be repaid. The sums being asked of Germany in reparations were many times more than was possible for them to pay, placing a severe burden on their economy, which later contributed greatly to economic instability and hyperinflation. John Maynard Keynes, the primary representative of the British Treasury at the time, said, "I believe that the campaign for securing out of Germany the general costs of the war was one of the most serious acts of political unwisdom for which our statesmen have ever been responsible. The German people believed they had been bitterly betrayed by their high command and unjustly treated by the international system, views that would later materialise throughout the 1920s and 30s. After the Wall Street crash of 1929 and the preceding Great Depression, the world was plunged into economic turmoil and Germany was hit hard. American banks withdrew the loan they won 230 seats, becoming the majority in Parliament. Hitler had found the failures and misery of the Great Depression to his advantage, stating for hard reality has opened the eyes of millions of Germans. In the 1932 election, Hitler also ran for president, and although he lost to decorated war hero Paul von Hindenburg, his rising popularity gave President Hindenburg no choice but to appoint Hitler on the 30th of January 1933 as Chancellor of Germany, head of the German government. Just 1 month after Hitler had been sworn in as Chancellor, a fire was started in the Reichstag by a young Dutch communist who was then used to paint all communists as the enemy of Germany. Using Article 48 of the Constitution, the Reichstag fire decree was passed that abolished civil liberties such as freedom of speech and freedom of the press. Shortly after, Hitler created a secret police known as the Gestapo, helping him to suppress any and all opposition. As Chancellor, he also tripled the size of the German military, violating the Treaty of Versailles, banned all rival parties, killed political opponents, and prohibited Jews from working, voting, and occupying public spaces. After the death of President von Hindenburg in 1934, Hitler declared himself Führer of Germany, absolute dictator. Hitler believed the world to come would be dominated by 4 main superpowers. Held in Geneva, Switzerland, the Disarmament Conference provided a preview for how Hitler operated and what future Nazi policy would look like. Hitler instructed his representatives at the conference to state that Germany would completely disarm, if, and only if, France, Britain, Japan and the United States would do the same. This was an offer that Hitler correctly assumed would be denied, and so he went back to the German people and showed them how this conference was not about disarmament, but rather keeping Germany subjugated. And so in 1933, Hitler withdrew from the League of Nations and the Disarmament Conference to the support of his people. In 1934, to the surprise of the international community, Germany signed a non-aggression pact with Poland, taking an ally away from France and weakening France's military positioning, as Germany was now free to the east. In March of 1935, Germany revealed it had been building an air force, the Luftwaffe, again breaking the Treaty of Versailles, with the justification being that Britain, France and Poland all had an air force and that Germany too needed to defend itself. 1 week later, Hitler declared his intentions to introduce conscription, to build an army of 500,000 men. Once again, the League of Nations protested, but no action was taken. The disarmament clauses outlined in the Treaty of Versailles had been destroyed. Then, in June of 1935, to France's horror, Britain had entered into a naval agreement with Germany. The Anglo-Germans. Germany was to be the main hegemonic power of mainland Europe, the British maintaining their international empire. The Japanese, or the Aryans of the East as Hitler liked to call them, would be the main power in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, and finally America would dominate the Western Hemisphere. Part of Nazi support was their opposition to the Treaty of Versailles, and upon coming to power, Hitler promised to return Germany to its rightful place in the world. Hitler's objectives were clear. The economy needed to be self-sufficient, on what the Germans called economic autarky, being able to produce their own goods and not relying too heavily on imports. This was critical to withstand a British blockade to trade, a policy that had damaged Germany in the First World War. Germany would also need Lebensraum, or living space, that would facilitate the growing German population. Lebensraum was to be found in the east, and this meant Germany would have to expand into Poland, Czechoslovakia, Ukraine, and agricultural regions of the Soviet Union. For Hitler, this new German Reich that was to be created was to be racially pure, containing only the Aryan race, free of Slavs and Jews of whom would have to leave or be eliminated. And it was also Germany's mission to launch a crusade against Judeo-Bolshevism, an ideology and enemy that home took the form of the Soviet Union. A war he thought would inevitably have to happen. The international system that had been envisaged was not able to cope. Without the support of the British and the United States' absence following a policy of non-interventionism, France was left alone to maintain and enforce the Treaty of Versailles, something it couldn't and didn't want to do alone. Naval agreement, in which Britain recognised Germany's right to build up its navy. They were to be allowed up to 35% of Britain's surface tonnage and a submarine fleet up to 60% that of Britain's. Britain had struck a deal, and in doing so had given up on Versailles, given up on disarmament, and began to show Hitler that a policy of appeasement was to be pursued. A year later, in March 1936, German troops were sent into the demilitarised Rhineland. The matter was referred to the League of Nations, which once again did nothing. Remilitarisation of the Rhine was the final nail in the coffin for the Treaty of Versailles and the international order. The treaty was now officially dead. France, in response to German occupation of the Rhine, constructed a Maginot Line along its eastern border. However, the fortification stopped at the Ardennes forest and did not extend across the Belgian frontier, the place at which Germany had entered during the Great War. The French were preparing for a war of the trenches and were not prepared for the motorised divisions that made German blitzkrieg tactics so effective. Stalin at this time, threatened by German power and aggression, entered the Soviet Union into the League of Nations, and also signed an agreement with Czechoslovakia, stating he would come to their aid if attacked, but only if the Western Allies would come to its defence first. This was to stop the West trying to push German aggression eastwards. Hitler wanted all German-speaking nations in Europe to be unified, especially his native homeland Austria. Under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany and Austria were forbidden to be unified, as the Allies hadn't fought 4 years to see a larger Germany. Austrian President Schuschnigg, knowing he would receive no help from